Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Progressively Incorrect. My name is Zach Groeschel, and I am so excited to launch a brand new season of Progressively Incorrect, a show hosted by me and sponsored by John Catt Educational, which publishes some of the best books in education. I am so excited today to be with Greg Ashman, who has inspired me through his writing and his advocacy for teachers and the profession as a whole. Greg, how are you doing today?
I'm doing all right, Zach. How are you?
I'm just watching as our weather gets a little bit worse every day as we're getting closer to fall. But you are calling in from Australia, correct?
Correct. It's the middle of winter here, so everyone thinks Australia's really warm, but I live in Ballarat, which is quite cool. It's about 400 meters above the sea level, and so it was a frost this morning when I walked into the office early to do this podcast.
Wow, very nice. I mean, people listening in on your accent might be like, you don't exactly sound Australian. Like, kind of briefly, how did you get over there, and how did you start, extending your educational journey to a different country?
Yeah, so I grew up in the UK, went to university there, did my teacher training there, and started working in UK schools, government schools, in London. By the time I left in 2010, I was deputy principal of a government secondary school in West London. But in the meantime, I met my wife, Jo, who is from Ballarat in Australia. And we'd had two little daughters, and we were living in West Watford, which is just outside London, in a terraced house, which is quite a little house, which the government owned part of because they had this scheme for teachers to help them out. And we realized that if we moved to Australia, we could essentially have a better lifestyle, maybe give our girls a better lifestyle. So we moved to Ballarat in the back end of 2010, sent my CV resume to every school in Ballarat and Geelong, which is a nearby city. We didn't want to go to Melbourne. We'd done big cities by then. We'd had enough of that. And to my surprise, the government schools weren't really very interested, and they had quite a complicated system for getting into government schools. And I was offered several jobs in independent schools. So I took a job at Ballarat Clarendon College, and I've been here ever since because I love the place.
It's awesome. And I've kind of been following the school's journey since you've moved from, teaching to leadership, and we're going to be talking a lot about sort of the model that and the research that underpins kind of the approach at your school. I'm very excited. I'm going to play a video here. It just started circulating on Twitter. Let's listen to this video. Okay, so the title of this is Different Ways of Learning Math.
Did you know there's more than one way to learn maths? One way is with step-by-step rules. Learning this way might work for a while, but it often leads to a fragile understanding. Then there's a deeper way, through investigation and reasoning, exploring why things work. And learning this way builds number sense and flexible thinking, and it sets you up for greater success in the long run. Some people think that students with learning differences can only learn through small steps, but that's a form of deficit thinking, because they too deserve to experience the beauty and the depth of mathematical concepts and connections.
What are your thoughts on that? Maybe pulling out some of your initial impressions.
Well, it's presenting a false choice. It's a very common one that we get in maths teaching, often not as expressed as openly as that these days. In recent years, this is essentially progressive education argument going back to, I don't know, the 1900s, maybe the 1800s. It's quite a familiar argument. You can trace it back to Rousseau. We've got to learn through experience rather than being told what to do. It takes this particular form in maths where procedures, how to do something is held up in tension in some way with understanding what you're doing. I don't think that that's necessarily the case. Clearly, there is a grain of truth there. We could teach kids to how to solve a problem and they don't really know what they're doing or why they're doing it, but they could still do it. The question is, what is that then? And I would suggest that's probably it's not in conflict with understanding. It's just not enough. We want them to understand what they're doing as well. What the video does is it puts these two things in tension. It says there's this way of learning steps and procedures, or there's this other way of learning through investigation and reasoning. And obviously, investigation and reasoning is better. That's not really supported by the evidence. There's an interesting little switch at the end of the video I noticed where the claim is made, some people think that the kids who are struggling need to learn through these little steps, but they deserve something else. No evidence here. No, the evidence suggests that that's not the case, or I have evidence to show that they can. No, it's just that they deserve something else, which I think is interesting. In maths, this has been explored quite a lot. There's a guy called John R. Starr at Harvard University who's looked a lot at this issue of concepts versus procedures, learning conceptual knowledge versus learning procedures. And he's done it a lot in the context of algebra and found that the two are mutually reinforcing. So just because you've learned a procedure doesn't mean you understand it, but actually it doesn't work against understanding it. It actually helps you to understand it. The two things are not in conflict. The two things work together. And there's a great paper by Bethany Richell Johnson, and John R. Starr is one of the co-authors, called Not a One-Way Street. And it's about the bi-directional influence of concepts and procedures. So basically, they're mutually reinforcing. So instead of the video putting them in tension with each other, they're actually mutually reinforcing. There's another thing I'd add as well. When I did my PhD, and I think we might even talk about this later, I looked into productive failure. And one of the things I wanted to do as part of my PhD was assess essentially conceptual understanding. Let's just leave it there for now. And I found this paper by Alibali and Crooks, I think, are the authors. I don't know, I might have to look that up, about assessing conceptual understanding in maths. And they pointed out that there's no agreed way of doing that. First of all, it goes from the kind of conceptual understanding that you might hear an education professor talk about in an almost semi-mystical way, to as soon as you start to try and research it, suddenly it becomes conceptual knowledge. And then when you try and figure out what that actually consists of, it's often reduced to a set of definitions. So one of the key things that people like to investigate in maths is children's understanding of the equal sign, because a naive understanding is it means put the answer there, whereas a more sophisticated understanding is it means a balance between the two sides. And yet, when you try and assess that understanding, often, essentially, you're requiring kids to trot out definitions, which you could potentially teach them to memorize, which is ironic, considering that people that go on about conceptual understanding as opposed to procedures often do so because they're concerned about memorization. And in fact, it's the procedures that you need the conceptual understanding to be able to do. You can't sort of fake your way through those or just remember something. You have to, well, I mean, it is all memory ultimately, but it's a much more sophisticated schema for long-term memory that you're drawing on in order to do that. So when I did my research, rather than try to directly assess conceptual understanding, on the basis of this, I used transfer, so the ability to solve problems that are slightly different to the ones that the students were trained in. And I think that's interesting because it is one of these things in maths that comes up over and over and over again, a tension between conceptual understanding and procedural understanding. But often the two things, not often, they always work together. And the more sophisticated thing is often the procedural understanding.
It is interesting, that part you mentioned that the video mentions at the end, I think around kids potentially with special education needs, who I think there's an argument to be made because explicit instruction sort of has a lot of its foundational research with kids who struggle in math and in other subjects, to honor the fact that they may have weaker processing, they may need things broken up in even smaller parts, they may need a little bit more practice, they may need a greater number of examples. It would seem like that would be more equitable and it would be more supportive to give students that type of instruction, rather than saying, like you said, it would be deficit thinking to think that they need more support. I don't know. It's almost insulting, that bit. It feels like to me, but I don't know.
And it's quite an extreme claim. So Broadly, obviously, there are two traditions in education, and it's unfortunate that, one's named progressive, the other's named traditional. And it's really unfortunate that they've acquired those names because people think, oh, well, I'm a teacher, I'm politically progressive, therefore I must identify with progressive education, which there's no reason to do so at all. Progressive education is quite individualistic. It's got a history with eugenics. Mussolini's education minister was a progressive educator. So there's no real need for people who consider themselves liberal in the North American sense to identify with progressive education. But the name, I think, is part of the problem there. But you've got these two traditions, and of course, most people are not. And people point this out as if it's an argument against the two traditions existing. Most people are not wholly on one end of the spectrum or wholly on the other. Now, the fact that that's the case doesn't mean that there isn't a spectrum and there aren't ends to it. That's fallacious reasoning. But most people are more pragmatic than that. And even if they have a broadly progressivist outlook, they will accept certain things from the traditionalist tradition. So most people in education generally would accept that explicit teaching, for example, is useful for kids who are struggling. And in fact, I read something recently that basically said, it was by an Australian advocate of inquiry learning called Kath Murdoch, who sort of gave way and sort of relented and said, look, well, if the kids are really struggling, maybe a bit of explicit teaching would be useful. So it's quite extreme within the progressivist tradition to even deny that, to say, oh, even if kids are struggling a lot, we would still not give them explicit teaching. We would because they deserve, like, again, not based on any evidence or any study that we can point to or any body of research. They just deserve, in this kind of moral sense, this less effective form of teaching.
There's another sort of thing that I've been following you writing for some time, and that is sort of, maybe it springs from like the five definitions of direct instruction from Rosenshine and other ways of talking about instruction, where either the researchers or the teachers or whoever's in the argument will basically equate explicit teaching, explicit instruction with just the I do or just the modeling phase. And of course, I do project-based learning, so I have a lot of explicit instruction because there is a lot of modeling, sometimes one student at a time, lots of modeling. But you kind of have advocated for maybe a more full system definition. Why is this so misunderstood?
One of the problems is that people are trying to win arguments. So you've got the two camps, the progressivist camp and the traditionalist camp, and people would like to persuade people of their position. And some of the sophistry that is deployed in that to those ends involves arguing about definitions. As soon as someone on social media starts asking you to define a term that is well understood by everybody, then you know that you're entering a argument that's about sophistry. That's part of it. Another part of it is that ineffective teaching practices have to keep changing their name because they're ineffective. So they become discredited, and so they have to change the name. So whole language becomes balanced literacy, and slightly different, I'll grant you that. But, a discovery learning becomes constructivist learning, becomes inquiry learning. Again, slight differences, and people will pull me up on that and say, oh, no, constructivist, and there's big key differences here. And people don't like them being grouped together. But the same fundamental principles apply, that students are expected to figure something, not everything. There is guidance. I mean, it'd be impossible if there wasn't any guidance tool. But they're expected to figure some things out, key things usually, for themselves, and that's the common idea. And so there's a lot of sort of fencing around definitions, and direct instruction has suffered from this a lot. When we talk about the two traditions in education, progressive and traditional, progressive has colonized almost the entirety of university education faculties, most of education bureaucracies. There are places that it hasn't reached, but generally speaking, it's the water that we swim in. And so they're ideologically opposed to direct instruction. And so they would like to define it in their terms. And so a few years ago, Barak Rosenshine wrote a paper called 5 Meanings of Direct Instruction, because he could identify 5 different meanings. There's the meaning that comes out of the teacher effectiveness research of the 1960s, which I'll return to in this rather rambling answer. I do apologize shortly. The DISTAR programs that we used for Project Follow Through, lecturing, just any kind of lecturing. What else? I can't remember all 5, but he identified 5 meanings. Now, essentially, you can define anything the way that you want to. So if to you explicit teaching just means the I do, then if that's how you've defined explicit teaching, then you can say that your project-based learning includes some explicit teaching. But that's not the explicit teaching that really has come out of the research. If we go back to this teacher effectiveness research of the 1960s and 70s, what people did is researchers went into classrooms, they observed teacher behaviours, and then they looked at how much the students in those classes gained between one assessment and the next, so test score gains. And they looked for correlations between specific teacher behaviours and test score gains. Some researchers looked at these behaviours, this set of behaviours that seemed to be associated with the greatest gains, and called it direct instruction. Thomas Brophy and J. Good called it active teaching. It doesn't really matter what you call it. It was the same set of practices. And if you want to look up what those are, the best source these days is Rosenshine's Principles of Instruction, which is widely available on the internet. And that's where these came from. And then later in the 70s and 80s, people tried, because that's just a correlation. So you can't prove that those behaviors cause those gains. It might be some other factor. So in the 70s, 80s, they start teaching teachers to do these behaviors. And then they see that, yes, when they do that, the students learn more. So now we're getting a bit more of a cause, although it's really messy educational research, as educational research tends to be, not very well controlled, not very, it's all messy. So then from the 80s onwards, you have this cognitive science tradition, which cognitive load theory sits in, of having really tightly controlled experiments. Now, critics of those then criticize them and say, yeah, but they're not like real classrooms. Yeah, but we've got the real classrooms as well, but they're messy. So let's have these tightly controlled ones, and points in the same direction. Test these different elements of explicit teaching, and it points in the same direction. And it's a whole system. So this thing, whatever we want to call it, is a whole system. Every line of research points to this whole set of practices. So you start, and at the start, you fully explain concepts, you fully model procedures before you expect students to use those concepts or apply those procedures. You gradually release control. The I do, we do, you do has become a kind of catch cry for that. We gradually release control to the students. And sometimes when explicit teaching isn't done particularly well, and which happens quite a lot, we don't ever get enough to the students working independently. We hold it too tight for too long. We gradually release control to the students, and then at the end, they are solving complex problems. They are, writing long essays. Like our students at my school, Clarendon, they do very well in our VCE exams, which they sit at the end of year 12, and they have to solve really complex maths problems that they haven't seen before. They have to write essays. So that's the end point that we want to get them to, the creative point, the problem-solving point. But the key thing is you start by fully explaining and fully modeling, and it's an entire process. And that's the explicit teaching that I mean when I'm talking about explicit teaching. So that's my definition. And that is incompatible with project-based learning or inquiry learning, because project-based learning or inquiry learning requires the kids to, at some point in some way, figure something out for themselves before it's being taught or modeled. There's been a series of papers that I contributed to in a small way. So Lin Zhang wrote a paper about science teaching in the US and how the standards, I'm not quite sure what you call the next generation science standards, I think, are based on just one body of research, which Zhang called program-based studies. So essentially, a new program is developed by researchers. They go and apply it in schools. If they compare it with anything at all, rather than just before and after, which some program studies are just before and after, they'll compare it with business as usual. Now that's great. I mean, if you've developed a program, you need to demonstrate that it works. It's not worse than business as usual. but you can't tell what elements of that program are effective. It could even just be novelty. It could be that it's more cool to do the new program with all the researchers interested in it than your business as usual, whatever that is. We don't know what that looks like. So Zhang argued we should look at other bodies of research, not just these program-based studies, which are often, because of the interests and enthusiasms of education researchers, a form of inquiry learning. Instead of just looking at these program-based studies, we should look at the things I was just talking about: teacher effectiveness research from the 60s and 70s, cognitive science studies, things like that. There was a response to that by Ton de Jong and thousands of other people. It's a massive number of people on this this response. And then I came in with the response to that. I was one of the co-authors on the response to that. And one of the things that de Jong had complained about in the first paper was a perceived definition of explicit teaching. And Zhang hadn't tried to define explicit teaching. So in this paper, we decided we would define explicit teaching. And that's the definition that I sort of launched with, essentially, that concepts are fully explained, procedures are fully modeled before students are expected to use those concepts or apply those procedures. But it doesn't mean that later on we can't do complex problem solving. Or it's just about how we start with the program of teaching, and then how it's going to evolve after that. So if you want to define explicit teaching in a certain way, I suppose that's your right, but you then cannot call on all this research evidence for the kind of explicit teaching I'm talking about to support what you're doing with your form of explicit teaching.
It sort of speaks to like this idea of balancing these approaches, which often comes up. Like, why not just have a balance of the best of all the methods? And those papers that you mentioned, like that was sort of how the response launched, was like, let's go into how to balance it best. I thought that it was a very clever, the response to the response that you and your co-authors did, because it sort of pointed out how bad the original response was. But maybe take us through that whole balancing argument they made.
So de Jong et al. Basically said they didn't really accept the point about the research base. And even in their final, there's a fourth paper, which they come back, they still don't really accept it. They essentially don't accept that a kind of expectation effect, like a placebo effect, like what I was talking about earlier, where the cool new study, everyone expects it to go well, so it does. In social science research, we often call that a Hawthorne effect, after this factory where they tried changing the lights and all this sort of stuff to increase productivity. And essentially whatever they did increased productivity because the people knew they were being experimented on. And it's called a Hawthorne effect. Well, they essentially rejected that. And then they didn't really address our points about the fact that we shouldn't base everything on these program-based studies. We should look at other bodies of research. They essentially have rejected all that. But the main thing that they wanted to say in their response is that there should be a balance between explicit teaching and, for want of a better word, and at risk of being criticized for rolling all these wonderfully different things together, I'm just going to call it inquiry learning. And they argued for a balance. Well, that's all well and good, but and this is the thing that I find frustrating, but I wonder where it comes from. People that argue for a balance are a bit like the people who say, I can't go into a class with a pre-written lesson plan because I have to teach to the students that are in front of me. They're all individual. They've all got different needs. And so I have to focus on their different needs. What they never do, and what the balance people never do, is tell you what criteria you're going to use this method with this student and a different method with that student. They just invoke balance and teacher, sort of as if teachers have this kind of mystical insight about what is going to be better for each specific kid, but they never explain how you decide upon that. So when de Jong et al. Argued for balance, they didn't say, well, in these circumstances, it would be appropriate to use explicit teaching, but in these circumstances, it would be appropriate to use inquiry learning. They never tell you what the circumstances are. They just try and sort of carry you along in this idea that, oh, balance is nice, balance is good, we should have a balance is wonderful, without defining those terms. So it's particularly useless to teachers. And it's the same as when people say, these kids in my class, they're all different, they learn differently, and so I'm going to have to use different strategies with them, without ever saying how you're going to decide what is it that the kid will do, or how will they present, or what will their behavior be, or what will their answers be and their responses be, that will mean that for this student you will choose that strategy instead of a different one. That's the question that always goes unanswered. So when we responded, we said, well, we can answer that question in terms of cognitive load theory. If you've got relative novices, they need explicit teaching. If you've got, this is paraphrase, if you've got relative experts, they need to have a bit more practice at problem solving, a bit more open-ended tasks. We've got this thing in cognitive load theory called the expertise reversal effect, where relative novices learn better if you give them worked examples. Relative experts learn better by just solving lots of problems. So we can answer that question when something's being modeled, as opposed to when you're asking them to do problem solving or create a complex task. You answer that question on your terms. When would you choose to use these different strategies? And that's the question that always goes unanswered.
There is a form of using, I guess not fully explaining, or not starting by fully explaining, a sort of form of that, which goes by various names: productive failure, preparation for learning, and pre-testing. They all sort of vary a little bit differently and maybe have different purposes. But it would be this idea that, okay, so explicit teaching is the main core of the system, but maybe just right before you do a full explicit teaching sequence, I do, we do, you give them a little bit of an opportunity to kind of warm up with the problem, or try it out. What do you think about that line of research, and sort of as you explored it in your own like PhD research? What is the state of that science?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So I'm going to draw a contrast here between education research and educational psychology research. So in education research, people make quite broad, fuzzy claims, the sorts of things that you might read in a filtered form on Edutopia, and you'll hear people talk about productive struggle. And so it's really, the kids were struggling in maths today, so that was productive struggle. That's great. And I think, well, that actually sounds quite frustrating. I'm not sure that would be great. Why would that be great? And that's the kind of ideological progressivist line. Struggle is good, etc. Educational psychology is more defined. Educational psychology experiments tend to be better controlled. They still have many flaws, which we will get into, but they tend to be a little bit better controlled than education more generally. And in 2006, Paul Kirshner, John Sweller, and Richard Clark published their paper, Why Minimal Guidance During Instruction Doesn't Work. And they tried to list all the different types of minimally guided instruction, and they got criticized. Fans of constructivist learning objected to it being called minimally guided, and I suppose that's all in the eye of the beholder as to what you think minimal guidance is. And of course, they weren't able to list everything. Anyway, there were maybe four, I think three responses to that paper. Then there was a response by the author to those responses. Then there was a debate at an American education conference. I think it was the ERA conference, I don't know. Then there was a book called Constructivist Instruction, Success or Failure. And in that book, it's a great book, advocates of explicit teaching get to make their case, advocates of constructivist instruction get to make their case, and at the end of each chapter, the other side gets to ask the chapter author questions. And then at the end of this book, Tobias and Duffy, the two editors, give their verdicts, and one of the editors, forget which way around this is now, stays on the fence, but the other basically says, look, the constructivist position is a position in search of evidence, whereas the explicit teaching position does seem to have a lot of evidence. And this seems to have had an effect on the community in educational psychology, in which now you'll find in educational psychology very few people who will advocate for out-and-out discovery learning. And what seems to have happened is that the progressivists within educational psychology have retreated into the position that you described at the start. Yes, we now accept that there has to be explicit teaching. We get that. But perhaps an episode of problem solving prior to the explicit teaching will have some advantages. Now, Cognitive load theory, when you apply that to this idea, would suggest that sometimes it might. So there's this concept in cognitive load theory called element interactivity. It's about how complex the learning materials are, but also about the expertise of the person learning it. So if I say to you, so say we're trying to teach kids to solve 3x equals 18. This is the example I always give. There's 3x equals an 18, 4 elements there, but there's a multiplication sign implied between the 3 and x. So there's 5 elements, but is 18 one element or is it 2? Well, again, already we're getting into this idea that when you get relative expertise, the number of elements reduces. So to someone in very early primary school, 18 is 2 elements, but to people who have gone through early primary school now, it's 1. But also, all these elements are in a relationship with each other, so that provides extra things to process. Now, if we think, as evidence suggests, that the mind can only process, the working memory, sorry, can only process about 4 new items at a time, we can immediately see that 3x equals 18 would exceed that for a complete novice. But within about a fraction of a second of me saying 3x equals 18, most people who have done middle school maths will know that x is 6. Why? Because you've got an entire schema in your long-term memory that just solves the problem without you even asking it to. That's the difference essentially between novices and experts. That 3x equals 18 is high in element interactivity, but if you've got a schema, you can solve it. In contrast, naming things, labels, they tend to be low in element interactivity. If I showed you a fraction and I told you the line dividing the numerator from the denominator is called a vinculum, well, that doesn't interact with anything else. It's just on its own. It's just something to remember. So you get all these, so that would be low in element interactivity. So you get all these experiments by people like Robert Buick and colleagues, and they do experiments with undergraduate students, and they say, they give them lists of words to memorize. And I'm going to make this up. This isn't an actual experiment, but this sort of thing. So you might have left, right, up, down, top, bottom, whatever, opposites. And one group, they'll give the pairs, and the other group, they'll give left and then R dash. So that group has to fill in the rest of the word. I forget what the others are. Up, down. So up, D dash, top, B dash. And they find that the students who have to fill in the word on the right-hand side memorize the list better than the ones that were just given the pairs of words. That's the kind of research that's behind this idea called desirable difficulties. And in cognitive load theory, that makes sense because these things are very low in element interactivity. So you've got to force the working memory to process them somehow, because a misconception about cognitive load theory is that we should always reduce cognitive load. No, we want to optimize it. We want it to be within the working memory limit, but we want there to be some load because part of the processing load is what creates these schemas in long-term memory. So if there isn't any processing load, we can't create the schemas. So that's how that works. So we would predict that pre-testing on things like labels or word names, or, what's the capital of Texas? And people say Dallas, and then you tell, it's Austin. That will work better than just telling that information, just because it requires some processing load. However, if you're teaching students something that's higher in element interactivity, which frankly is what we're doing most of the time in schools, writing paragraphs, solving equations, that sort of thing, that tends to be higher in element interactivity, and we've got relative novices. So then cognitive load theory would predict that pre-testing, productive failure, trying to solve the problem before being given instruction wouldn't be as effective because it would overwhelm working memory. Now you have these studies. So there's a guy called Manu Kapoor from Singapore originally, and he's done these studies. And essentially what he does is he gives, now you'll know more about this than I do. I don't know baseball, but he gives baseball stats to the kids. And so they give the batter statistics and they ask the question, who is the most consistent batter, right? Now, this is a question that you would solve in the canonical solution is to find the standard deviation. So it's just a mathematical thing. But they give it to the kids to try and solve their own way. Who's the most consistent batter? And they come up with things that sort of approach ideas of range and stuff like that, and they have a go. But they're never gonna come up with standard deviation because that's quite an advanced concept. Then they teach them standard deviation. And his research suggests that this sequence of getting them to try and solve the problem themselves and then teaching them the standard deviation is more effective than the other way round. But I would question that research. So in my PhD, I looked at that and said, but there's something funny going on here. So you've got two groups of kids. One who are given this one problem and told to solve it as many different ways as they can. The others that are instructed in standard deviation. And then they switch round. So the kids have been told to solve the problem as many ways as they can are taught standard deviation. But the ones that have been taught standard deviation are now given one problem and told to solve it as many different ways as they can. Well, that makes no sense. That's not what you would do as a maths teacher, because you've taught them the method. You wouldn't give them the one problem and say, solve it as many ways as you can. You would give them lots of problems to practice with the method you've just taught them. So I decided that I was going to try this to resolve this problem myself in my research. And I came up with quite a novel experimental design. And I decided to explore. So part of this idea of productive failure, there's lots of caveats. So if you ever actually wanted to try and use productive failure in the classroom, there's a whole list of conditions that you've got to follow in order to get it to supposedly work. So it's not great in that sense anyway. And one of them is, well, to get the kids to try and solve the problem on their own, they have to understand what the problem is. It has to be in language and terms they understand. And given that they're relative novices, it's quite hard to find problems. Like the batter problem is a rare example of the sort of things that kids can grapple with and understand what they're trying to do, even though they don't have knowledge of standard deviation. So I had to come up with something similar. And so I had I hit on the idea of looking at the efficiency of electrical devices. So useful energy output over energy input times 100%. That's how you calculate the efficiency. They were given these different light bulbs. They were given the energy that they took in and the energy given out, and various iterations of that. So sometimes I also gave them the wasted energy, so the heat energy, which isn't useful, and I said which is the most efficient light bulb, and often the kids would pick the one that gave out the most light, irrespective of how much energy it took in, and so on. And so what I did is I had a lecture theatre, so that's 90-seater lecture theatre, and I had randomly assigned my kids into two groups on alternating rows in this lecture theatre. The one group were given lots of these light bulb problems, and they could solve as many or as few of them as they liked. The other group were given a reading task to do on energy from photosynthesis stuff, nothing to do with the study at all. It was just a placeholder, a filler. Then, when they'd done that, I taught all of the lecture theatre together the concept of how to calculate energy efficiency. They had little calculators, and they had to hold up their answers on their calculators every so often. So I ensured some interactivity, which is key for explicit teaching. It's not just a lecture, it's always interactive. And then the two conditions flipped around. So the ones that had done the problem solving read about photosynthesis. The ones that had read about photosynthesis, they did the problem solving. So I was able to compare problem solving followed by explicit teaching with explicit teaching followed by problem solving. And the beauty was the explicit teaching was exactly the same for all of them. So in some of the other experiments for productive failure, the explicit teaching has taken place in two different classrooms. How do we know it's exactly the same? How do we know that the experimenters' expectations didn't affect things and change the way they taught in the two classrooms? Well, I couldn't, because I was teaching them all together in the one lecture theatre. Then I didn't do an immediate post-test. So often in cognitive load theory, you give them a post-test straight away. But because I had this sort of staggered thing, I was worried that that might affect, the timing might affect an immediate post-test. So I gave them the post-test a day later, in some cases about 3 days later, so that would wash out the fact that there was a sort of 20-minute difference between the two interventions. And I found either no effect of the order or an effect that supported the explicit teaching first. And I think that that's quite powerful, because I think it's a tighter design of the experiment, and it was relatively high element interactivity because you had to do a calculation, you had to pull data from a table, this, that, and the other. When a few years ago, Manu Kapoor got a write-up in the New York Times for productive failure, and the classic broadsheet kind of write-up about research, it was very positive about this idea that you can learn from failure and we can set these things up. And I wrote to the editor of that section and said, look, I'd like to write a reply here. I did my PhD and I found the reverse. He was very positive, but I never got my right of reply. So that still stands. People read it, still think that that's what the state of the science is. I disagree.
I mean, I try to understand why sort of proponents of the productive failure model would think that, among all things, it would be highly motivating to start with a failure episode. It just seems that seems to me the part that I guess I can get to the fact that maybe it's sort of we're sticking to the baseball metaphor, like you're just creating a glove in the mind that's ready to catch the episode of explicit instruction. But it just seems like day after day, 180 days of instruction, giving students something to start with, saying, I can't do this. And you're sort of looking around the classroom, who else can't do this? Oh, maybe it's just me who can't do it. It just doesn't seem like it would scale to the classroom. But I don't know if you have any further thoughts on the model. It's been plaguing me. It's been bothering me for some time.
I think the key thing there is motivation. So a lot of people would believe and buy into the idea that explicit teaching might be effective, but alternatives are more motivating. And you've hit an idea as to why they might not be. And I think people get very confused about motivation. We don't like motivation. It's one of these things when you look into the research, you can't measure motivation. You have to measure something else. There's no one thing called motivation. So you look for self-concept. Do I see myself as a mathematician? Self-efficacy. Do I feel I could solve this problem? Interest. And then you've got situational interest versus long-term interest. There's lots of different things that you can measure. But the key finding is that achievement and motivation are highly correlated. And we think the interaction goes two ways. So achievement leads to motivation and motivation leads to achievement. But there's some evidence that the achievement to motivation direction is stronger, particularly in maths. There's a maths study from Canada that seems to suggest that. I wouldn't claim it's a one-way interaction, but I think that we neglect the achievement to motivation direction. And what this means is that, think about it, you do something, you learn to do something you couldn't do before. You feel good about that. You feel motivated, so you go again. And this is something that happens all the time. If someone starts running, sometimes they'll give up because they don't want to get up in the morning and all that sort of stuff. But as soon as they start to see that their time improves or they're getting a bit fitter, that makes them motivated to keep going. And we see this with hobbies and pursuits and interests and things. If ever you've seen someone and thought, gosh, I don't know, why are they so interested in that obscure hobby? It's probably this interaction between getting a sense of accomplishment and then being motivated by it and so on. So the idea that you would eschew success, that you would avoid success, and you would intentionally make students struggle it just flies in the face of everything we know. Yet it's by people who think that they own the field of motivation. Those in the progressivist tradition think they own motivation, and it's the traditionalists who want to bore kids silly and all that sort of stuff. So it's really quite a fraught field. And I think in origin, it goes back to a misunderstanding, which I think is probably best expressed for now by David C. Geary's distinction between biologically primary knowledge and biologically secondary knowledge. Biologically primary knowledge is stuff we've evolved to acquire, like our local spoken language, how to navigate a local area, folk psychology, what makes people tick. We seem to be motivated naturally to learn that. So you don't take little kids, sit them down in a classroom and say, this is where you put your tongue to make an S sound. You do with a small minority who struggle and need speech pathology, but the vast majority of kids you don't, because they're just motivated. They pick it up through inquiry, through investigation, and all of the stuff that I've said about explicit teaching doesn't apply to this biologically primary stuff because we're motivated to learn it and we pick it up through immersion. And the misconception is to think that we can learn everything that way. Because we can learn our local language that way, we'll just surround kids with books, and they'll just learn to read, and we'll just read to them, and it'd be joyous, and they'll just learn to read because they'll learn it through immersion. But reading is not biologically primary. Reading and writing is a recent invention in human civilization. It's ancient Sumerian writing about 5,000 years ago. Since then, most people haven't learned to read and write. It's only in the last 100 years or so where we've decided it's a good idea for everyone to learn that. We couldn't possibly have evolved a capacity to pick that up naturally. And this is why schools look artificial and regimented, and because it's quite hard work to learn this stuff. And we're not naturally motivated to learn it. So the way we build motivation, in my view, is to get an experience of success. It's pretty cool when you can do something you couldn't do before, and that's what sustains you. But to get you to that point, we have to get you to be able to do something you couldn't do before, to give you that sense of achievement, that sense of satisfaction. And explicit teaching, the evidence is just really good at that. So there's no conflict between explicit teaching and motivation. But unfortunately, people on the other side of the argument think motivation is their issue, think they own motivation, think that their methods are more motivating, and will not be persuaded otherwise.
I wanted to, as we come to a close here on this fantastic episode, I wanted to give you a chance to talk about something you've been working on recently, which you started a petition in Australia around a sort of an important issue in an organization that's been very influential in Australia. And it's sort of, it gets at a lot of things I've been wanting to pick your brain about around teacher prep programs, around teacher voice in Australia. Yeah, tell me what you've been working on lately.
Okay, so this is a little bit inside baseball. I think that's the phrase that you guys use. So I do apologize. There's some arcane elements to this. So teacher preparation, teacher training, I would call it, in Australia. Generally, there are bright spots, but generally it's not very good. And frankly, from what I've heard, it's not very good anyway. Now, immediately someone, if there was a teacher educator on this call, they would howl me down and say, where's your evidence for this? And my evidence is anecdotal. Of course it is. I did do a bit of a survey for my blog last year, but I wouldn't say that was any kind of solid research. But every teacher I meet pretty much says that their teacher preparation wasn't great. And this is a self-preservation mechanism from researchers. They don't research the quality of teacher education programs. And so therefore, because they don't research them, there's no peer-reviewed papers on it. So they can then say, oh, where's your evidence to say that teacher prep programs are no good? And, well, you haven't collected any. But so it is anecdotal, but any teacher listening to this will know what I'm talking about. They'll know that there are elements of their teacher education that were ideological, that were not practical, sometimes very interesting, about, like, a lot of teachers are left-leaning. They're quite receptive to ideas about equity and diversity and things like that. But that doesn't necessarily tell them what to do in the classroom with a group of kids, and it's not particularly useful in that way, in a way that I imagine other professions like surgeons would be told how to hold the scalpel and all that sort of stuff, not just that, talk about equity and things like this. So we've got teacher education programs, and they're not great. They're not generating much practical advice. Education faculties of universities are not great. The researchers are not really motivated to provide practical advice to teachers. They're motivated to signal to peers. That's how that works, and to adopt whatever the intellectual fashions of the time are. And so they don't produce stuff that is useful. So the government in Australia, and the government, we've got a strange structure. We've got states that largely run education, but we've also got a federal education minister who runs bits of it. I won't try and unpack that all for you, but they all got together, all the ministers from the different states and territories and the federal education minister, and they set up this company called the Australian Education Research Organisation, AERO. So they created this body, and this body was there to collect evidence and provide advice to teachers. And it's been really good at this. You can look it up. If you search AERO Education, AERO Education, you'll get their website, and they've got some really good resources on classroom management. From the teacher perspective, it's not enough to just train teachers in classroom management. You need a whole school approach to classroom management, but for training teachers in classroom management, their resources are really good. It's got really good resources on explicit teaching. So we even set our teachers a reading, in inverted commas, over our last term break, which was to watch a video on explicit teaching from AERO. Really good, really practical, useful in all the ways that traditional education research is not, because it is focused on what you can use in the classroom. So this ticks along for a couple of years. Teachers are using the resources. People like me are assigning it to teachers to look at and stuff like that. And then all of a sudden, education academics decide that Aero must be destroyed, and they write all these blog posts. They've got a blog for the Australian Association of Research in Education. They write all these blog posts attacking Aero, attacking the fact that it's got charitable status. I don't know what that's got to do with anything. Saying, railing against scripted lessons and one-size-fits-all approaches and all this sort of stuff. And this just so happens to be at the time that a consultancy firm, KPMG, has been hired by the federal government, I think it's the federal government, to do an evaluation of the effectiveness of Aero, which is coincidental. I don't know why that's happened. And so I'm seeing all these people attacking Aero. I'm seeing how useful Aero is to many teachers. And I'm seeing that there's a review going on. So first of all, I encourage teachers to complete the survey that's part of the review. But then Rebecca Birch and I got together. We both got Substacks, so we got a bit of reach. And we decided we'd draft an open letter to Australia's education ministers explaining why we value Aero, why they should continue to support Aero. We drafted that, publicised it on our blogs, and then we got over 400 signatures, mainly from teachers and school leaders, but we also got academics and other education professionals to sign it. The majority were teachers and school leaders. And then that sort of segues into your other point. And one of the things we didn't collect was the name of the teachers' schools in this petition, open letter, whatever you want to call it. Because in Australia, it's very strange that essentially, if you work in the government system, you have to sign up to media and social media policies, which effectively prevent you from commenting on education. Now, I think it's fair enough to say teachers can't go out and be rude about their principal or attack a parent or name a child and say how terrible this child is. That would be completely unprofessional. But the idea that teachers in the government education system can't express opinions on explicit teaching or differentiation or ability grouping or whatever it is, I think is bad, and it's bad for democracy because when people go to vote in elections, they don't know what teachers think about these things, the people that actually work in the system, because they're not allowed to talk about them. And I think this is a big problem with our democracy here. In the UK, it doesn't seem to be the same issue. Teachers still have, we're still governed by media and social media policies, but the way they seem to be applied in the UK doesn't seem to stop teachers from having these debates online and arguing and things like that. I'm not sure what it's like in America, but I do hear some voices from America where people are sort of throwing around these ideas. But we do have this strange thing in Australia where teachers are kind of muzzled. So, and I'm not, because I'm in an independent school rather than the government system. But this is why I think there should be, in Australia, this thing called a right to professional comment. So if you're a professional working in an area, you should be able to comment professionally in areas that are within your expertise. Again, not about individuals or not about airing gripes that you might have with specific people, but about policy issues and things like that. I think that should be a protected right. But at the moment, it's not. So when we put our open letter together, we just left people's schools off so that they could sign this, and hopefully there wouldn't be any implications for them for signing it.
Wow. You're right. It's like you said, inside baseball. It's sort of like there's several like kind of important issues though embedded there, which is just how to sort of resolve the disconnect between academics who don't really understand or care about teachers' needs, how to give teachers the right to public comment, which I think we kind of take for granted here. Like I said, people here are on the other side of that where they're making TikToks of kids and not doing right. They honestly shouldn't be doing what they're doing. Yeah. But and sort of amid that, I think somewhere in there is just like how the really useful resources, especially around cognitive science, that's come out of Aero. I've used them. I've passed them to people that they may be under attack for other sort of hidden, maybe ideological reasons. I find it fascinating. I really do hope that listeners follow your work as I do. I subscribe to the Substack, and maybe you could tell them like how to follow you and kind of keep connected with your ideas.
Ah, sure. So my Substack is filling the pail, all one word, which is a bit of a joke, but we won't get into that now. .substack.com, fillingthepail.substack.com. I'm at Greg_Ashman on Twitter or X. I am on Blue Sky. There's not much going on Blue Sky. I can't remember what my handle is. And yeah, that's it. And so you'll usually find me over either on Twitter or on Substack saying stuff about education.
Awesome. And I will post listeners links to Greg's books. Little guide of cognitive load theory is probably the tiniest book you could pick up on the subject, and you could read it in just in one sitting, and it's fantastic. Also, the truth about teaching and a few other writings. And we mentioned some articles. I'll post the links there. Greg, it was absolutely an honor to have you on this show. I really look forward to what you produce next.
Thank you, Zach, and sorry for rambling so much.
No worries. All right, we'll talk soon.
Cheers.